Hey everyone, my name is Nate Ferguson here from Escarpment Laboratories, and today is the next part in our advanced logger series. Today, we're talking about the advanced science of loggering, mainly talking about the methods. Who am I? My name is Nate Ferguson. I'm one of the co-founders here at Escarpment Labs. I'm also one of the professors at Niagara College for the Brewmaster and Brewery Operations program. And my goal here is to provide you free, accessible insights into brewing science, techniques, and methods and tools to help both professionals and homebrewers, improve the quality of your beer. So let's get to it. Other bits, we're turning 10 years old. You've probably already heard this. I'm sorry. But we're turning 10 years old. It's a big deal for us. So we're going to keep telling you about it. And if you want more information about all these different videos that come out and all the different pieces of information or content we have coming out, go online, go to YouTube, hit subscribe, like, do the thing. So this knowledge series is broken down into 3 parts. We've already covered the basic part, the fundamentals. Now we are firmly into the advanced areas. We're now talking about some of the oddities, some of the unique elements, really digging into some of the details associated with some of these different types of loggers. So this presentation we have today is up-to-date knowledge that I have as of April 25th, 2025. Now, as always, if you find anything that's wrong, I'm fallible. Please let us know in the comments. We'll change it, we'll update it, let everyone know. Now, a little preamble for today. We are going to be going over some models. It's only a model. These are lagering models. You've probably seen a few of them today, seen a few in the past. The goal of today is to help you demystify them. Some of these models look a little counterintuitive to each other. My hope is to help explain them. Hope to give you the context around these models so you understand what information to take away from it, when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate. So let's meet the models. We have 4 models we're mainly going to be going over today, and they are, in order, the classic Czech. I like to call the S.D.G model, as we'll talk about soon. This is more iconic with certain breweries like Budvar or Czechvar, Pilsner, Urguell, these kind of classic old school Czech-style breweries. We then have the Narziss method, which is a Bavarian standard. Things like Augustiner Helles or Hofbrauhaus Helles, these will all use this sort of method. We then have our macro method. These are your Budweisers, Coors Lights, things like that, Miller, MGD, all that stuff. And then we have our arguably doesn't exist, arguably does, kind of the newest model added is our modern Czech or crafty method. We'll talk more about that at the very end. Now, here are all 4 of the methods on top of each other. We're going to go through each one of these individually. This is just a nice summary page. If you want to reflect or want to compare and contrast the two at a later point, you can find it here. Now, there are a lot of other lager models that we are not covering. There's too many. Now, some of these other ones are kind of the Northern German. It's kind of between a Narziss and a macro, kind of an international light lager. We'll talk. You can figure out how that one works. We talk about it more at a later point in the other presentation. There's also an ultra cold polishing. Not talking about that one today. It takes too long. Arguably non-commercially viable. And we're also missing over the kind of pseudo lagers or Kolsch. Those will be separate videos. We come out kind of comparing and contrasting these individual topics. Now, why should you care? Why the different lager methods? Well, there's good reason. It's kind of confusing. It's almost like confusing for me too. If we understand the context around each one of these different models, each one of these different methods, we can understand why a brewer might be doing what they are doing. That will allow you to make better decisions and improve the quality of your beer. That's why you should care about these different methods. Now, it also is important to understand why the different methods or what the context around these different pieces, these different lagering techniques, because time is money. It is. If we've all probably had that stare from someone who, when you tell them, hey, I want to lager this beer for 4 to 8 weeks, that's going to cost a lot of money. So it's important that we understand how these different lagering methods work so that we can use our time and our money most effectively. Knowledge puts the tools in your hands. So let's get to it. So here's a little bit of a TLDR for the entire video. Over time, as technology has changed, methods and standards have upgraded along with it. When we have our S.D.G, our classic Czech method, we were pretty low tech. There wasn't a lot of technology associated or even available with brewing. As we started seeing people like Narziss come out, we started having more tech, kind of a standard level of technology that we'd associate with today. And then we have our macro breweries, and any sort of new technology they have access to because it's going to increase their throughput and save them money. Using these methods without understanding the context associated with them is going to cause you a lot of frustration. So I don't want you to do that. So keep watching. So we're going to roughly break down today into a few different areas. We're going to talk about first a little review. Why do we lager? What are we even trying to do with this thing? We're then going to break things down based on when it happened. We're going to go through a little history lesson today. We're going to talk about monastic brewing. We're talking about the classic Czech or S.D.G method. Talk about Narziss and his impact on brewing. We're then going to talk about how Narziss developed everything into the modern macro brewing. We're then going to talk about a few other small topics at the end. So, like all these things, the devil's in the details. Some of these information that's in here, I have to glance over. We're trying to keep this to like 45 minutes to an hour and a half. If we went longer, it'd be too long. Devil's in the details. So if you have any further questions or want to get really nitty-gritty into this, we can help you out. Just email us. So the history of lagers can be roughly boiled down into this. Lager is this constant fight, this constant infighting between tradition and efficiency. Tradition and technology. As technology has progressed, we have seen changes and developments in the way in which people make lagers. So with this in mind, it's very useful when we're talking about lagers for us to explain the history associated with it and for us to understand why certain things exist. Is that method you're familiar with a relic of history or something that's actually important and useful for you to be increasing or improving the quality of your beer? So we're going to hit the history first. Now, this is roughly the evolution of lagers. Originally, we had traditional cellaring fermentations like the 1800s or so. We're not fermenting in stainless steel CZVs or conical fermenters, even horizontal fermenters. It's wood. It's wooden tanks. The cellar is as cold as the cellar is. It's winter. We're brewing now because we can't brew in the summer because of the Reinheitsgebot or because it's too warm. We then started seeing some breweries advance. They dug deeper caves. We invented lager yeast accidentally. Spaten breweries had much deeper caves, much deeper cellars, which allowed them to make beer for longer periods of time. This is how they developed things like the Dunkel and the Vienna lager, which was out in Vienna. We then, right after that, saw the brewers take the things that the guys in Vienna and Bavaria learned and make Pilsners with them. We then started seeing, world wars were in the middle of there. Increases in efficiency were required. We then started seeing some people look at this brewing process and see how can we optimize this thing further. And then we went further into that with the macro breweries who really pushed this to its extreme. So we're going to break all these kind of history portions down into about 6 different sections. First, the monastic period, then early lagers, the first Pilsners after that. We're then going to look at World War I and World War II very briefly. Talk about the Narziss era because it had a massive impact on the way in which we look at lagers. And then we're going to talk about macro breweries. Now, this is oversimplified. I cannot cover everything for this. But for today, this is absolutely suitable. We are missing a lot. So we're also going to mention a few different standards as we go through this. As I hit a standard, we're going to break it out, outline it, and show you all the important working bits of it. Show you where something can be moved up or down area. Show you an area where, say, maybe the weather or the climate impacted how these things were actually pulled off and achieved. So we're going to first start off with the monastic period. Now, the beer at this point is not what we would classify as beer today functionally. This is beer meant as a provisional beverage. It is meant as a way to get available carbohydrates. That's really about it. So beer manufacturing processes here weren't systematized. They weren't even consistent by any means within the one person. If you're looking at trying to replicate this, the fermentation occurred cool, just whatever temperature was outside. Fermentation time was highly variable because they didn't know how much yeast they added. They didn't know what yeast was. They just kind of hope it started to ferment. Lagering temperature was the cellar temperature. And lagering time was 2 to 6 months, maybe. These are provisional beverages. This is just meant as a way, for you to get calories and for you to stay hydrated because in many cases you couldn't drink the water. So what broke the monastic period? What broke or switched humans from brewing this kind of uncontrolled way into something more streamlined? In short, Napoleon. Now, this is oversimplified. Napoleon broke what was known as the Holy Roman Empire into fragments. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was housed in Vienna, become important a little bit. He formed the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806, which after his defeat was ratified by the Congress of Vienna in 1815 into the Austrian Empire. That will become important shortly. Now, it's important to note that, especially after this Austrian Empire portion, all the areas we're about to talk about when it comes to the Czech, we're talking about Germany, Bavaria, Austria, these were all one country. We think of them as separate places now, but at the time, they were all functionally the same place. People traveled, people moved, people communicated. They all spoke German functionally. It was very easy for these people to move information and move around. So it was not like beer making was isolated in Bavaria and Germany. These people were all the same. So these areas were all the same country. There were no barriers present. So how did this all start? Well, one of the first well-documented textbooks or pieces of literature that allowed people to improve the quality of beer making was written by, sorry, I'm going to say this incorrectly because it's Czech, Franciszek Oderje Pupe. I always call him Pupe. Published The Art of Brewing Physically, Chemically, and Economically. This was one of the first brewing textbooks that utilized things that at the time were very novel, like thermometers and hydrometers. These are pieces of technology that we all think of today as absolutely essential, absolutely of course we're using thermometers and hydrometers. They're basic. These were new technology in his time. Pupe's text really pushed all the other brewers in the area, again, all the same country, so we're talking Bavaria, all the rest of Germany, talking Vienna, Austria, really allowed these people to realize that they were important, and he influenced many, many, many other brewers in the region. Doesn't get enough credit. One of those people he influenced was Gabriel Sellemeyer II, also known as the Younger, who took over Spaten Brewery, very prominent, to this day, a German brewery, in 1839. Now, he was close friends and collaborators with another individual, who'll become important soon, called Anton Dreher. And these two traveled to Scotland and England in 1838. I know we're going through a lot of history. In 1838, to learn about new pale malting technology. The English were actually the ones who developed the ability for us to make very lightly kilned grains. Before this point, almost all the grains used in brewing were functionally dark, very highly, some would be very, very black, some would be very, very light, not consistent or uniform by any means. These two went over to England and Scotland and learned how to make these new lighter malts. And their breweries took off because of it. Now, he is known for the Munich Dunkel. That's kind of the Spaten's original claim to fame. However, they very quickly started using all these lighter grains and making lighter and lighter and lighter colored beers, along with Dreher. Which then brings us to Dreher. So he was a friend and collaborator of Sellemeyer. Anton Dreher, who invented the Vienna lager, which is originally called the Marzen, which is where that beer style gets its name from, or March beer, produced this beer in 1840. Now, he was a businessman. Sellemeyer was more of an academic. Anton Dreher was more of a businessman. He helped spread this type of brewing, these lighter beers, these more amber, not dark beers, all across not just Austria, but further afar as well. Now, he then also produced another brewery. My Hungarian is bad, but Kobanya Brewery in 1862 before his sudden death. This brewery was then taken over by his son, and through his descendants, his beers, one of the beers they produced still has his name on it, Dreher Gold. Anton Dreher is one of the main reasons why these lighter beers, these lighter lagers of the day, became popular all across Eastern Europe. So Sellemeyer and Dreher both encouraged other breweries to use these techniques. They didn't hoard them to themselves. They shared this technology with everybody. They adapted the learnings from Pupe to improve the quality control of their beer using hydrometers and thermometers. And on top of this, Sellemeyer in particular helped establish the Weihenstephan Institute of the Bavarian Brewing School, which is still active in producing highly skilled brewers to this day, arguably one of the most important brewing education places in the world. Now, these two are off. They're teaching all other people in Bavaria and Austria. Everyone's learning from how these two are making high quality beer. They're winning awards. They're spreading their influence. And they influence Urguell. Now, in 1838, going a little back in time, Pilsen, never heard of that city before, they had a very bad year of brewing. Everything was bad, and this caused the entire region to get together and say, we need a new brewery. So they started constructing this new brewery, which would take several years, and they hired a Bavarian brewer who had been influenced by Sellemeyer and Droll, named Urguell, which you see right here. Now, October 5th, 1842, Urguell brewed the world's first pale lager, which we now call Pilsner Urquell. He used local soft water, Moravian barley malt, which is lightly kilned, Saaz hops, and Bavarian lager yeast. Not Pilsen lager yeast, Bavarian lager yeast. And this created the Pilsner as we know it today. Now, based on attempts to recreate this beer, because people have gone back, taken what notes we had from Urguell and try to recreate the beer, here's roughly what we know this original beer looked like. It was fermented somewhere around 6 to 8 degrees Celsius. The fermentation time was likely highly variable. We didn't know what yeast was at this point, so how much yeast was pitched was unknown. Lager temperature was about 0 to 4 degrees. We'll talk more about that in a second. And the lagering time was about 3 to 6 months. They had much longer winters and abundant ice in Czechia, which we'll talk about and the importance of it soon. So these three, Siddelmeier, Dreher, or Groll, really were the three foundational people when we start thinking about these old school lager breweries and how we kind of the common lager that we come to today. Now, there were others. There were absolutely others that influenced this entire area, but I think it's useful to kind of have these three people. In my opinion, they did some of the lion's share of the work on this. They laid the foundations of how lager beer was made all the way up into post-World War II. So we owe them a huge deal of gratitude, which is why I think this method should be called the S.D.G method. Siddelmeier, Dreher, Groll. I think it's a good name. So what is it? A little summary on this. So these guys took all the initial learnings from Poupe that he had in his textbook. Siddelmeier and Dreher adopted the scientific methods from Poupe and then also added decoction malting to decoction brewing, which we'll talk about later. And they made their beers lighter. Groll then combined this information, used Czech soft water and Saaz hops to make what we now commonly call the Pilsner. There's an Isaac Newton quote that this comes to mind in this that says, "If I have seen further, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants." These three could arguably be called giants. So what is it? What is this S.D.G or classic Czech method? Well, let's break it down. Here's what it looks like. So this is kind of our first standard. So let's break it apart piece by piece. Now, these fermentations start roughly at 6 degrees Celsius, which is quite cold. These fermentations would then slowly ramp up in temperature, roughly to about 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. Now, they didn't have glycol jackets. They didn't have anything like that. There's no, refrigeration or anything like that. They were still dependent on the seasons. They were still dependent on their environment for cooling. So these temperatures are a bit, fungible. They can move around a little bit. Fermentation is allowed to complete until the beer is finished, and then it is cold conditioned. Now, at this point, to cold condition, they would either move it further into the cellar or, just closer to somewhere cold, or they'd actually bring in ice blocks, a very common method in Vienna, in Austria. Not so common in Siddelmeier's area. You have to be aware what the time and place of this is. These people were not using what we would classify today as common brewing equipment. Their mash tuns were wood. They didn't have stainless steel. They didn't have large metal vessels. They didn't have steam boilers. Wort cooling was however cold it was outside. Transferring was rudimentary. They might have some basic hoses, but nothing like we have today. Mainly a lot of pouring was involved. A lot of troughs were involved. And for mashing, thermometers were new. These were not your standard techniques that were available that we see today. It's not brewing as we know it. So there are also, as we look at this method, there are some regional differences between these three different brewers. Again, all three, Siddelmeier, Dreher, and Groll, were all brewing their beers at the same time in these different areas. And they had different methods. Now, why is this? Mainly due to the climate. If we look at Bavaria, they typically lager their beers for about 4 to 8 weeks. In Vienna, they do about 6 to 10 weeks. And for Pilsen, they would go anywhere from 8 to 12. This is mainly just due to how long their winters were. There's nothing fancy about this. This is just how long was the winter. In Bavaria, you have roughly 3.5 months of winter. That's around -3 degrees Celsius. In Vienna, you had about 3 months of about -1 degree Celsius, so shorter, but they had easier access to ice, so the lagering period was typically able to be longer. And Pilsen, the coldest of the three, they would have at least 4 months of -5 degrees Celsius with lots of access to lake ice. The lagering time we see with these breweries probably had more to do with the functionality, just how long could they physically keep the beer cold for, than it had to do with the actual product quality. This is especially true for the Czechs because they were the coldest of this region. That's it. You have to look at the technological limitations of these areas of the time period because they did not have refrigeration. The Czechs typically had their beer the colder the longest because they could. The people in Munich, the Bavarians, the inverse. They couldn't keep it as cold because it's warmer. That's it. Now, this did start one of the traditions that we see that's still to this day used by a lot of the Czech breweries. The Czech breweries typically hold their beer for about 90 days at 0 to 2 degrees Celsius. And this is thought to be a tradition, a bit of a callback to this era. 90 days is roughly how long the Czechs had available to keep this beer that cold. So this makes sense. And to this day, we still see Budvar and Pilsner Urguell use this method for the beer they produced, so they say. This has kind of become a bit of the hallmark of this brewing style. We'll see that later. This now brings us to World War I and World War II. So at this point, people have been brewing this way of lagers. They've been using the S.D.G method for about 100 years, give or take. This has become the standard, the tradition, if you will, of brewing this style of lager in this part of the world. Now, obviously, with the World Wars, things change. Barley becomes harder to get. They have to ration any sort of carbohydrates associated with these things. We start seeing efficiency or waste. Efficiency become more important. Waste become less tolerated. And you start to see this growing consensus among brewers that they had to become more efficient in manufacturing their beer through the wars. This is one of the things that pushed many, not just the one we're going to talk about, but many breweries to realize they have to increase, change their methods. Enter Narziss. The World Wars required more efficiency and order in the manufacturing of these lager beers. And this caused several people, including Dr. Ludwig Narziss, to push for these changes to occur in the industry. Now, at the time, around the World Wars, we saw massive increases in technology. These increases in technology are some of the things that Dr. Narziss took to improve the quality of the manufacturing after the World Wars. Now, Dr. Ludwig Narziss was a professor at the Weihenstephan Institute, originally founded by Siddelmeier, and was known as the beer pope, a term he apparently rather enjoyed, who published many papers and methods on modern lager production. Narziss's goal was through the adaptation of technologies and systems, fermentation, maturation, and clarification could be sped up or refined without sacrificing quality. Narziss saw that all the manufacturing protocols inside the brewing industry at the time were not efficient. These 90-day cycles or the way in which they were making their product was unnecessarily time-intensive and costly. He needed to modernize. He said we needed to modernize, and so people did. So Narziss was trying to achieve a few different things. Let's run through a few of them. He wanted to improve consistency and predictability. Before this point, you still saw a lot of things tied with the seasonality. Narziss didn't like that. He wanted to increase throughput without sacrificing quality. In some cases, increasing quality. This was achievable with modern technology, or at least modern technology of his day. He also wanted to optimize the flavor development. A lot of things that were happening inside these breweries damaged the quality of the flavor. Not good. He also formalized yeast handling and flocculation that we're not going to talk about today, but is very important. He also standardized brewing science for teaching in the industry. He was massively impactful at the Weihenstephan Institute, and that institute still bears his name everywhere. Narziss's publication that is still very impactful today, sorry my German, is Abriss der Bierbrauerei, or Outline of Beer and Brewing, which was published in 1976. This was a summary of a lot of the works he had been working on since the 50s. He'd been pushing these methods. His methods built on tradition, built on the S.D.G method, and towards the systemic processes that we now probably commonly all use today. He introduced temperature controlling with cellar panels and things like that, temperature ramps, diacetyl arrests, yeast behavior monitoring, clarity when it comes to maturation, step cooling, all sorts of different things that many modern lager breweries use till this day. So what does the Narziss method look like? This is one of the most iconic things Narziss is known for, is the Narziss method. So let's take a look at it. It is roughly an inoculation at 7 degrees Celsius. However, it then ramps up in temperature to about 8 to 14 degrees C. It has an optional diacetyl arrest for 24 to 48 hours. We'll talk about that more in a second. It is then not cold crashed. It is stepped crash, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius roughly per day. Some a bit faster, some a bit slower. Lagering then occurs between 0 and 2 degrees Celsius for 3 to 6 weeks, more for higher ABV beers. He believed that beer should not be left alone to the climate. Brewers should be in control of the entire process. If it's colder outside, you should still be in control of your beer. And here's what the Narziss method looks like. Again, you can come back here and refer to it at a later point if you want. So let's just talk about kind of some of the technological limitations of the time. It's important to note this because otherwise you may not realize the impact some of these things had. First off, temperature control. Temperature control at industrial scale was technically available in the 30s and 50s. Spaten had it, but not many others did. This only really became cost-effective for most even businesses around the early 70s. That's when Narziss was really pushing some of these works, was when temperature controlling become viable for most businesses. CCV, or closed conical vessels, large, tall fermenters, weren't really available until the 70s or the 80s. Now, he still preferred horizontal fermenters for most breweries, but until this point, CCVs weren't even a possibility. And on top of this, closed or CO2 purged cold sides, something that we take all for granted today. Just pushing CO2 around so we don't oxidize the product. That wasn't really commercially viable for most businesses until about 70s and 90s, depending where you were. This is the environment that Narziss was initially working in. Now, Narziss is also influential in emphasizing the importance of yeast health. He pushed that yeast is the fourth ingredient, which was an uncommon sentiment up until this point. A rough translation of some of his work says that yeast is not merely a biological agent, but a fundamental raw material. Its handling must be controlled, measured, and understood. Only then can consistent quality and efficient production be achieved. That was originally in German. It was roughly translated to English, but it's true. Very needed. Narziss pushed the principle that yeast contributions to flavor and its pitch rate, viability are impactful on the beer. Prior to Narziss, people didn't understand that yeast was even alive, or that it could be healthy or not healthy. And for this alone, there's many reasons we owe him a great deal of thanks, but for this part alone, I owe him a great deal of thanks. So let's break down this method. Let's go nitty gritty, break each part apart. Let's talk about why we start at 7, why the fermentation ramp, why the optional diacetyl rest, why we step crash, and why we cold condition at 0 to 2 degrees for 3 to 6 weeks. So first off, why does it start at 7 degrees C? Yeast don't like being chilled. That's a general rule. Whenever you apply cooling to the yeast cells, it typically stresses them out. In extreme cases, they produce things called cold shock proteins, which will actually stress the yeast cells out. They have to break other things down to produce them, but it keeps them alive. Now, he showed that these colder temperatures, for lager yeast in particular, actually increase their viability. Excellent. So he started cold. Now, yeast cells also don't mind, in some cases actually quite like, when the temperature is warmed, elevated. So by starting at 7, we get the nice health benefits of having a colder fermentation, and then we allow them to slowly rise up into the happier fermentation temperature between 8 and 14 C. Not bad. Now, why the fermentation range of 8 to 14 C? That's a pretty big range, so let's talk about why it is. Now, fermentations were not typically held at one of these two temperatures. They would typically ramp up. So we would not go, say, exactly from 7 degrees C and then go to, 10. You'd likely see a fermentation start around 7 and then maybe spend a day or two at 8 and then spend a day or two at 10 and then spend a day or two at 12. The fermentation will be allowed to slowly rise through this temperature range. This would make it so when as the sugar concentration gets lower, as the fermentation becomes more stressful for the yeast cells, the higher temperature makes it easier for the yeast cells to do everything. As the nutrient stress increases, the environmental temperature goes up and it balances it out. This is very nice. This is very beneficial for the yeast cells when it comes to flavor compound production and health. This is great. Now, there's a trade-off here. If we go to a higher temperature, because not everyone would go to the 14, many would stop at 12. If we go to the higher temperature, it will produce more esters. It will produce more aldehydes. It will produce more of all the compounds that we typically don't want in lagers. But it will go faster. We'll also typically see more diacetyl reuptake. It is a balancing act. There are no solutions, only trade-offs, as Thomas Sowell says. Higher temperatures will produce more compounds. Colder temperatures will produce less. Higher temperatures will consume more compounds. That's about it. So this then brings us to this optional diacetyl rest. Now I need to emphasize this was optional. There's one reading, again, everything's in German, and I don't speak German, so I'm relying a lot on translations for this. That some of the things that Narziss has produced have suggested that he didn't always believe this should be done. That this should only in some cases be done if there was an off flavor that needed to be cleaned up. The optional diacetyl rest would depend on many different things. As you can see in some of the other content we've produced here at Escarpment Labs, diacetyl can be controlled. Acetaldehyde can be controlled. If we have, say, less fan available, we're going to see more diacetyl being produced. If the fermentation temperature has fluctuations or gets too high, we're going to see more diacetyl be produced. If we pitch too low, or extreme cases too high, we're going to see more diacetyl produced. Sometimes our strain selection will produce more diacetyl. There are ways to control this. And if whatever the reason may be, your fermentation had diacetyl, this would be a way to help clean it up. Now, Now, this diacetyl rest would not be a quick rise up. It would be subtle. It would be slow, roughly 1 to 2 degrees Celsius per day. And it would be anywhere between, 14 to 18 Celsius. Some would hold at 16. Some wouldn't get all the way to 18. If the problem was severe, maybe you'd go to 18. This is not an absolute requirement. This is an option. If you have a problem in the fermentation, you can help correct it by doing this diacetyl rest. So why not always do the diacetyl rest? It's here, why not do it? Well, it's quite simple. If we do the free rise, we're going to lose some of the positive flavors inside that beer too. Many of the nice flavor compounds we see in beer are sulfur compounds. Some of them are. As we increase the temperature, we're going to see some of these positive sulfur compounds also flash off. We will also see a lot of the negative compounds flash off or get removed. Typically, the higher the temperature the lager is allowed to get, the less flavors in total, positive and negative, we're going to see being produced, or we're going to see in the final beer. That's it. In my opinion, it is always better to make boring beer than bad beer. So if you suspect that you have a problem, or you suspect the fermentation is having a problem, it's struggling, do the diacetyl rest. Let your yeast cells clean everything up. It's a good idea if you find yourself in a solution you need to clean up. And now, the next part. Why step crashing? Why not just cold crash the beer from fermentation temperature, that'd be 14, 12, 18 if you did the diacetyl rest, all the way down to 0 immediately? Well, there's a lot of good reasons for this, actually. So Narziss was a very large proponent of step crashing, and this allows for a gentle settling of all the different compounds inside a solution. Now, we are going to talk more about this in a later video, so I'm going to say that. There's a whole next video about temperatures during this phase of the process. So we are going to skim some of these things today. So why do this? Well, first off, we're going to settle out the yeast cells. If we cold crash too quickly, this happens for ale and lager yeast, we can cause those things I mentioned before, cold shock proteins to occur. By slowly crashing the beer, we don't produce cold shock proteins. The yeast cells can slowly adapt. Now, on top of this, there is something that's not well known, but there is an optimal flocculation temperature for yeast cells. We're going to talk a lot more about this in the next presentation. That optimal range is about 10 to 14 Celsius. At this range, the bonds that attach yeast cells together to make them larger, they are optimal. We're still seeing the yeast cells synthesize or produce more of these proteins that bind and attach to each other. When the yeast cells get too cold, they stop producing them. When the yeast cells get too cold, they stop working as well. They don't bind as strongly. So around 10 to 14 degrees Celsius is the optimal rough temperature for most lager yeast cells to come out as a solution. Ale yeasts are typically a bit higher, but not by much, maybe 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. This is typically the optimal temperature for this binding of the yeast cells to occur. We'll talk more about that in the next presentation. By step crashing, we hit these ranges. Now, the other reason for this is this kind of gradual cooling, not for yeast cell precipitation, but haze precipitation. Did I mention we're going to talk about this in a later presentation? There's a lot more to talk about for here. Gradual cooling allows for tighter sedimentation to occur. A lot of the haze that we see inside a beer are these protein polyphenol interactions. And just like the yeast cells, where they need temperature to bind, these protein polyphenols at too cold of a temperature stop binding. They don't interact with each other well. At higher temperatures, a certain higher temperature, they bind more efficaciously. Around 10 to 8 degrees Celsius is where we see protein polyphenols maximize their binding. When we step crash the beer, we will enter into these temperature ranges. We will enter into these temperature zones that optimize protein and polyphenol interactions to allow for maximum protein polyphenol sedimentation, along with the yeast cells when we're at the higher temperature. So why then go down to 0 to 2 degrees Celsius? Well, it's kind of simple. Certain molecules, even if we make them bigger, we give the yeast cells the ability to bind to each other. We give the protein polyphenols the optimal temperature to bind to each other. Let's look at the yeast cells. If the yeast cells, my fingers are little proteins. If they don't have them, they can't bind to anything. This will happen if the yeast cell is sick. For the protein polyphenols, if they get broken off, they get clustered, they get hit with other things, they're not going to be able to use them. Sometimes we just need to make the liquid as minimally soluble as we can. We need to make it so that nothing can actually dissolve inside of that liquid. And that is why we bring it to 0 to 2 degrees Celsius. That's it. Sometimes to get certain molecules out, we have to get it as cold as we possibly can and hold it. And that's why we hold the beer at 0 to 2 degrees C for several weeks. By step crashing, we allow for these cascading events. We allow for the yeast cells to settle out. We then allow for the protein polyphenols to maximally settle out. And then whatever is left over, we're just going to slowly crash out at 0 to 2 degrees Celsius until lagering is done. We're going to talk more about this in a later video. This time required for the settling, for these proteins and polyphenols and yeast cells to settle out of suspension, this was time that the macrobreweries of today saw and did not agree with. This is too much time for them. They need to increase the efficiency. This is one of the ways, or one of the places we started seeing the macro guys change Narziss's method to further increase throughput. How'd they do that? More technology. We'll see in a second. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Narziss, he was quite old. He was very prominent between the 50s and the 70s. Dr. Ludwig Narziss died on the 29th of November in 2022 at the age of 97. He was massively impactful in our environment. He was massively impactful in the beer industry, in brewing, for beverage technology, known throughout the whole world as an expert in the brewing industry. We owe Dr. Narziss a great deal of respect for his over 40 years of influence on here. Now, the reason I have this here is twofold. One, he has had a massive impact on the way in which modern breweries operate. Massive impact. For that, we all owe him a great deal. The second is that when I talk to breweries about making lagers, and I bring up Narziss, most people have no idea who it is. So if you've been brewing, if you're a home brewer, if you're a pro brewer, and you're in between, spend some time. Go look up who Narziss is. He had a really big impact on our industry, and you should know who he is. Now that we've talked about Narziss and the massive impact he had, let's talk about the next step. Let's talk about the macro breweries. Now, before we talk about what they do, we got to talk about a few different things. I'm going to show my hand up here. I think they make great beer. I think the macro breweries, it is technologically impressive. The beer is amazingly neutral and clear. I've drunk a bunch of it. It is very easy to drink, and sometimes that is exactly what I want. Sometimes I want something that is nice and delicate and has depth of character. Sometimes I just want something that is beer and that is wonderful. And that is what a lot of the North American consumer wants. One of the funny things about quality is that quality is subjective. Is this banana with duct tape on it art? I don't think so, but many other people do. And that's fine. You should not mock somebody else because of the way they make their lager, in my opinion. Now, if the lager is bad, you do you. But quality is funny. Some of the beers we look at here, so some of the macro beers I think are absolutely excellent, but they have not nearly the complexity and flavor development some of the German brewers, some of the beers that are made with the Narziss method. That just is. Yeah, in order to think about this, I think it's important to kind of look at what these two different areas are looking for. In general, the Germans are looking for flavorful, delicate, depth of character beers, but subtle, nothing aggressive. The North Americans are looking for easier drinking, less complex, very super clean, and for the manufacturing, fast. So yeah, I'm not going to say one is higher quality than the other. Quality is subjective. The North Americans were making beer a bit differently than those in Germany, in Austria, and the Czech Republic. They're using kind of different ingredients. So let's dig into it. One of the most iconic things when it comes to North American style light lager is the use of adjuncts. So when did it start? The use of adjuncts in brewing in North America predates 1880. Now, there is a Czech-born Austrian living in New York named Anton Schwartz, who is the editor of the American Brewer, or Des American Brewer, sorry, my German. And he was one of the first people to formally push for the use of adjuncts. He suggested that it improved the foam stability of the beer and allowed for North American brewers to use cheaper 6-row feed barley in their beer making. By the turn of the century, this method was normal for all beer being brewed in North America, and we have to thank a Czech-born Austrian for it. The main adjuncts we see typically used in North American style light lager are corn and rice. Now, both of these have a lower protein content or lower FAN content, which generally results in less yeast growth and therefore less esters, less aldehydes, less flavor compounds in general. This lower protein content also lightens the body of the beer, making it thinner, lighter, crisper, which is one of the iconic elements of this style. Corn does tend to provide a light sweetness to the product, with rice being a bit more neutral. Note, I have overly simplified this here. we can talk more. We have other resources online that talk a bit more about this. So up until World War II, almost all North American beer was brewed similar to the Germans, except for the use of these adjuncts. They adopted many of the methods pushed for by Narziss also post-World War II. Narziss's methods weren't just for the Germans or for the Europeans. They also came over here. But they had some ways to further improve it. Again, quality is subjective, so for the North American consumers, they could. So where do things go from here? Well, North Americans found other ways to improve the efficiency or the throughput of their production. Again, without altering the quality. Again, quality is subjective. The biggest thing they did when it came to improving the quality of their product or increasing the throughput was something called high gravity brewing, which radically changed the way in which North American beer was made. So what is it? High gravity brewing was developed mainly in the 1950s and 70s through many different US macrobreweries and a few Scottish that would become important soon. Trials for this started in the 50s and really started to ramp up by the 70s, where it started to be commercially adopted by many, many different breweries. Now, what you see here on the right-hand side is the pilot plant at Heriot Watt in Scotland. This is one of the places where high-gravity brewing was first pioneered and refined. This process is where instead of brewing, say, a beer to 12 degrees Plato, it would be brewed to 15 to 20 degrees Plato, or 7 to 9% ABV, or alcohol by volume. You make a very strong beer. At which point you then add de-aerated water, or water that can't oxidize the product, post-fermentation to bring the beer down to 4 or 4.5, 4.2, 5%. Now, Narziss was still alive at this point, and he was cautious about this method. This really only took hold in the UK, North America. You didn't see a lot of Germans using this method. Now, one of the main people who pushed this method, his name is still alive. His name is Dr. Graham Stewart of Heriot Watt. He's not the person who invented this, but he has often been cited as the voice or the mouth of high-gravity brewing. He did a lot of consulting and helped a lot of the macro breweries from the 70s until now adopt high-gravity brewing, make it efficient, and put it into practice. For this, we do owe him a great amount of debt. I've heard the guy speak a handful of times. He's awesome. Huge wealth of knowledge. And this is what it looks like. Now, the method for high-gravity fermentations is different than what we'd see from Narziss. Much more efficient, high throughput. Now, here's the Coles notes for this method. We're going to inoculate the wort for this beer around 12 degrees Celsius, much higher than the other lager fermentations we've seen. We're going to ferment around 15 degrees Celsius with a pretty quick ramp up in temperature. Not much higher, but higher than we saw for the other methods. We're going to ferment for only about 7 days, if not less. We're then going to cold crash the beer suddenly, down to about 2 degrees Celsius. And then finally, we're going to lager this beer from 0 to 2 degrees Celsius for about 1 to 2 weeks. This is a high throughput method, neutral tasting, ideally off flavor 3, that can be consumed by all. Now, there are many technological implications associated with this method that we have to talk about. And if you don't do these methods, you're going to have a bad time. This is not going to go well. So, what are they? First off, this beer is aggressively filtered. The aggressive filtration allows for shorter lagering times to occur for this beer. Instead of using lagering to remove proteins and chill haze from the beer or yeast cells, we can filter them all out. Makes our life much easier. Yeast is also selected for these beers to be more neutral. North American lager yeast or Mexican lager yeast produces less flavor compounds in general right off the get-go. On top of this, the beer is roughly 1/3 water. Last I checked, water is neutral to no flavor in it. Excellent. That is going to make a very light, neutral tasting beer. On top of this, everything is highly dialed in, which means there's less errors to occur. Everything is automated, which is excellent. One of the other big changes between, say, a German-style brewery and a North American-style brewery is the use of vertical fermenters, or CCVs. These are very, very tall. And as you've seen in another video, when we start fermenting tall, we start applying hydrostatic pressure, which functionally slows down the fermentation, making it cleaner, almost like you're fermenting at a colder temperature. That's great. For the lager breweries, the large-scale lager breweries, they don't have to apply as much cooling to this beer, which is excellent. By using these tall fermenters instead of having horizontal-like fermenters, they can ferment higher. That's not a problem. And finally, we have something that's called cold filtration, which is going to sound silly. It's going to sound like a marketing gag, actually. But it does have a little bit of an impact. Just from chatting with some large-scale macro breweries, This is a thing. They will freeze, they'll cool the beer below freezing in many cases, down to -1, -2 degrees Celsius. Now, if we look at, say, 5% beer, that has a freezing point around 2.5 degrees Celsius. Very close if we get the beer down to -1, -2. But if we have 8% beer, 9% beer, 10% beer, that has roughly a freezing point of 3.8 Celsius. So if they bring the beer to -1, they're okay. They can get this beer colder. They can remove even more molecules, even more protein and polyphenols from the beer. Now, a note, the yeast cells must be removed prior to this. They must. Otherwise, if we freeze them, they're going to shatter and come out of solution immediately. Not good. And we're going to go through cold filtration. We're going to talk about this more, but cold filtration, when we have all these molecules, when we freeze the beer, this -1, -2, it's going to cause molecules to come out of solution, which we can then filter out. If the molecules aren't out of solution, we can't filter them out. That's it. Cold filtration, surprisingly effective. Now, there are many other people associated with this method. It's not just the people I've talked about so far. There's many others. Macrobrewing has been a team effort by many, many, many. But here are a few I wanted to highlight. There's Joseph Oads. From 1960 to 1970, he pioneered the use of enzymes to further dry out and stabilize and optimize production set of North American-style light lager. There's Dr. Charles Bamforth, also known as the Pope of Foam, who focused heavily on beer foam stability and process consistency, still active in the industry. There's also Dr. Michael J. Lewis, who founded UC Davis out in California. Their brewing program, where he promoted high-gravity brewing and has done lots and lots of research and promoted many important works when it comes to the field of macro brewing. So macrobrewers are always asking this question: is this tradition worthwhile? And the question this is a question I think we should all be asking. And sometimes, yeah, there are still some macro beers like Budweiser that are still fermented in horizontal fermenters because they like the flavor. They're all trying to work swiftly. They're trying to lager swiftly. They're breaking all the rules in the way of doing it. So we've covered a lot. We've covered a bunch of different individuals. And I think it's important for us to understand kind of just the landscape we're working in. From the very beginning, Poupe pushed for thermometers and hydrometers for us to be used. Basic stuff from today's standpoint. S.D.G, they allowed us to have pumps, larger tanks, roughly modernization. Narziss pushed us to have basic temperature controls, glycol chillers, CO2 purging, things that, again, are kind of common for today. And the macros are doing whatever they can to push this thing further. Some of these traditions have been birthed out of technological limitations. The 90-day lagering was just probably a relic of how cold it was in Czechia. Some traditions are present to increase quality of the beer. Others aren't. The line can be blurry, so test them, play with it, have fun with it. We stand on the shoulders of giants. So just a little rundown here. We have Siddelmeyer, Dreher, Gross. We have Charles Bamforth, Stewart, and then Narziss. All these guys, we owe them a huge amount of debt when it comes to making lagers. So this is not exhaustive. We've covered a lot, but this is by no means an exhaustive list when it came to lager making. I had to leave stuff out. Believe me, I had to. I hope that through understanding these progressions, these standards evolutions, that you understand why these different things are there, what's been birthed out of necessity, and what's actually there to increase the product's quality. That if you're trying to make certain styles of beer, you're not going to all have the same techniques, and that these techniques are always changing and evolving, always. Which brings us to our final method, which is sometimes called the new Czech method, despite not mainly being done in Czech. You see this online where people are talking about this. This is kind of the craft lager. It's everywhere. This is people just having kind of a fun and it's messy with it. They're taking different pieces from all four of these different schemes, or all three of these different methods. They're taking maybe a 90-day lagering method. They're taking step cooling. They're doing anything they want. It's kind of a mishmash of all these different methods put together. Some people are trying to call this the new Czech method. I think it's people just having fun. It's people just trying to figure this thing out. So those are the models. I hope you understand how these four different models work, why we'd be using them, why you may want to choose one of them over the other for the beer you're trying to make. And there we have all the different temperature graphs. If you want to learn more about these, spend some time, look at the graphs, understand why each one goes through, and go back, maybe relook at how each one functions. Now, a little bit word of caution on this. I have to say a word of caution on this. There are some of these methods that, if you don't have the associated tech with them, won't go well. In general, If you don't have the tech associated with high gravity brewing methods, you might have a bad time. A little example, if we ferment at higher temperatures, without taller fermenters, so no osmotic pressure, without dilution, so no 1/3 of water being added to the beer, you're going to have an estery beer, period. There's almost no way around it. This only works for high gravity brewing guys because of the other techniques and technologies they have available to them. Really make sure you see everything in aggregate, everything together as a whole, not just take one piece of this information out individually. You have to see how everything works together. Now, there are a few topics on this we missed. The biggest one is probably going to be decoction. Some of you are probably thinking about this and screaming it to yourselves, or maybe at me. As a quick rundown, for the S.D.G time period, double and triple decoctions were quite common. For Narziss, single and double decoctions were quite common. For high gravity brewing, we are just doing infuse and mashing, nothing else. And for the modern Czech, anything goes. That's really about it. We'll have a separate presentation on decoction at a later point. Now, this then brings us to the next presentation. I've alluded to this a few times. Next presentation, we're going to go through loggering theory. We're going to talk about the chemical and biological reactions that occur and how to optimize them during this loggering period. How do we know if it's done yet? And also talk about fining and filtration. So I know there's a few different topics we've left out today. We'll talk about those next. So as always, thanks for watching. Hope you guys learned something. Hope you can take something away from this presentation and improve the quality of your beer. If you want more, you can find our knowledge base, our YouTube, and our blog, where we have tons and tons of content that's present for you to improve the quality of your beer. And thanks for watching. Cheers, everyone.